Okay, so Chapter 10, Arrays. An array is essentially a list. It's kind of like if you know that you think of a list of items. So a normal variable holds one piece of information, but an array is like a list that holds multiple items by the same name. It's almost like a shopping list. And that's a one-dimensional array. We'll talk about two-dimensional arrays next week or the week after. But a one-dimensional array essentially is a list. Some of the things we'll talk about in this thing here is we will initialize arrays and refer to individual elements of the array, store lists and tables of values in arrays. So we may get to tables. Tables would essentially be a two-dimensional array. Talk about how to pass arrays to functions. An array, the name of an array is really just a variable, just like any other variable that holds a piece of information. And we'll look at how to search and sort arrays, declare and manipulate multidimensional arrays. So we will get into multidimensional arrays today. Again, start with looking at arrays and different examples of arrays, declaring and allocating arrays. We'll look at the random number generator again using arrays. We'll look at some of the examples we looked at last couple of weeks, but we'll look at it in a more of a array setting and see how they can be done more efficiently in an array session. Data structure. Arrays are essentially data structures consisting of related data items. The first thing we'll look at is a one-dimensional array, and that's like a list. Instead of one piece of information, you have multiple pieces of information, but they're generally all related to the same thing. JavaScript arrays, dynamic entities that can change size after they are created. So actually JavaScript arrays are dynamic. Traditional arrays in traditional languages are not dynamic, which means once you create them, you're stuck to that size. An array, again, is a group of memory locations that have the same name. So there's a couple of different parts to an array. One is the name, which is just like any other variable. And then there's something called a bracket, which indicates what piece of information in the array you want. And it's kind of like having a list of 10 items and saying, you know, what's the fifth item? The fifth item from the list is what I want. And the brackets is where you put that item number, essentially. First element in an array, so it's a list, and there's one little difference that some people get caught on, is that we say the array is zero-based, which means it starts with 0. So the first item on the array is not 1, it's 0. And this has to come back to what arrays are. Array is a variable is a location of memory, some byte location in your computer's memory. And the array, index into the array, is really what we would call the offset from that memory location. So the first piece of information on the list would have no offset from the memory location, and so it's 0. That's why the first element in an array starts at 0, because right at that location there's no offset. The second item on the array would be offset by 1 times however much memory is used by the item. And the third location in the array would be 2 times that as well. So arrays start with 0. So it takes a little adjustment to realize that you're thinking in 0, 1, 2, 3 instead of 1, 2, 3, 4. But that's about the only difference. Other than that, what's in the square brackets is simply the number. Also, another thing that arrays have is a length, which tells you, it's array name.length, which simply tells you how many elements are in there. So an array of 10 items, the length would be 10. Here's an example of an array. Let's say the array name is C, and it's got a value. So the first value, again, remember, starts at 0. And then the next one on the list would be 1. And so you can see it's just a list. In this case, it looks like it's a list of 12 items. Because it's 0 to 11, so if you were to count that up, that would be 12. Um, talk about associativity of these things. Brackets are similar to the open paren and closed paren, which some languages use for arrays as well. It's left to right, which means the index is fed into the array name to get the actual location and memory of it. And of course, the associativity of the other operators, we've looked at those already. JavaScript arrays are what we consider objects. In most languages, modern languages, they're considered objects. And an object is something that we would also call a complex data type. Right? Your simple data types like a number, 1, 2, 3, or a string or something like that is considered a primitive data type. It's only got one piece of very small amount of memory it's using, one piece of information. Arrays, though, have multiple amounts of information, and they can be very long, very large in size. So we would call those objects or complex data types, and all complex data types are objects. To create an array, there's a couple of different ways of creating an array. The way it's done in most languages is with something called the new operator, which simply tells the language to allocate new memory and refer to it by this name, and put the address of that new memory in this name. And we'll see that in a moment. There are some other ways of creating arrays as well, but the standard way is with the new operator. The new operator creates an object as the script executes by obtaining enough memory to store an object. So normally you have to tell it how much memory you want, at least initially. In the case of Java, it will grow, or it will reallocate an array when a value is assigned to an element that is outside the bounds of the original array. And not all arrays in all languages do that. JavaScript does. So it's a smart array. Generally considered a good practice to separate your JavaScripts into separate files, just like we do with cascading style sheets. Now, we've not seen that yet so far, but it's very simple to do. You just have to give a reference to that file, just like you do in style sheets. Okay. Okay, so this will be the first example that we'll look at. And the actual HTML is very small, but you can see in here the script, and says, which generally means a scripting language of some kind, and it always defaults to JavaScript. It's pretty much only JavaScript, really, at this point, is equal to, and the file name that we find the JavaScript in, and the output. And I've already got those couple of ones loaded. Let's see. So here's the script again. It's referring to this file called init-array.js. And here it is. And you can see the first array is being initialized, new array 5, which means it's going to go out there and it's going to ask the computer for enough memory to store 5 items on the list. And the second one doesn't, it doesn't give a number, which means it allocates an array, creates an array, and it generally will default to just one location. And we can see, the different lengths and size of these things. And then we're going to, in the first case, we're going to go use a for loop to go through the size of the array, and we're simply going to allocate numbers. It looks like it's going to be the number of the for loop that's going to go into the array each time. And n1 is the array name, and I is the index into it. Starts at 0, and then it goes to the next memory location and puts the data there. The second for loop, because the size of the second one would be 0 or 1, can't use the length. So instead, we're going to hard code the number 5 to it. And we're going to go through it. In this case, because this n2 started out as nothing, it's going to dynamically reallocate it each time. That's kind of a slow process. So in general, you want to take a best guess as to the size of the array and give it that initially. And if you need to reallocate, that's okay, but you generally want to take a best guess just to make it a little more, performance a little better. Okay, the next thing we're going to do is we're going to call a function output array, and we're going to pass the actual array in, which we can. And when you pass arrays to functions, you just pass the name of the array, because remember, the name of the array alone, without any brackets, is a reference to the very first byte in memory, and then from there it can go further. And the heading, of course, is just a string, and this is going to be the location where it's going to put it, the output. And what this thing is doing is it's building content. We've seen that before. It's getting the length of the array so that the for loop can go through it, and it essentially looks like it's building a table with rows and putting the numbers in each one. And it looks like it's going to build one row for each one, so it'll output it in a table format. And then it'll go through and do the same thing with the second row. So let's see what the output of this would look like. That's essentially what it would look like. And we can go ahead and, let's see, I can go ahead and show it to you. There it is. And okay, it's going to go through the same code again, telling us what's going on. Does anyone have any questions so far on any of this? Kind of a new concept, but not really. Just a one-dimensional array. Just think of it as like a shopping list, a list of items. Right? Things on your shopping list would be related to each other, and that's what you would do. JavaScript automatically reallocates an array, which I mentioned as well, but you still want to take a best guess at it for efficiency purposes. When accessing array elements, the index value should never go below 0. Yeah, you can't go below 0. That's a definite error, for sure. There are no negative indexes. Some other ways of initializing arrays, we'll look at it. The array can be created using a comma-separated list in an initializer list in brackets, and we'll see that in a moment. The array size is determined by the number of values in the initializer list. The initial values of an array can be specified as arguments in the parentheses of the array, so we'll look at that as well. A couple of different ways of doing it. And the size of the array is determined by the number of values in parentheses. The example in figure, well, let's take a look at that. That should be the second one here. So we'll take a look at this one. Okay, so here's some examples. Another way of doing it. And it's just different ways of creating arrays. New array, and it passes in a list of 4 items. So what this will do is create an array with 4 items in it. So the size will be 4. In this particular case, it's going to create an array with 4 items again, and they'll all be numbers. In this particular case, it looks like it's 4 items again, but the middle 2 will be empty, but they'll still be there. And then we'll output each array using the same program. Okay, so you can see we get the same thing. The 2 that were empty in the middle, they're undefined. They have no value. Any questions so far? Okay, let's see if we got a question here. I understand arrays for the most part, but much of the comprehensive JavaScript code examples in Chapter 10 and 9 seem rather complicated. What level of understanding should we have at this point regarding JavaScript? Not much, and you don't have to worry about it so much for the midterm, because any midterm questions on JavaScript will be very simple and basic. This is a first programming class, so I don't expect a lot yet. Although, the labs are increasingly about JavaScript, so you want to try and maybe start attending some of the Thursday labs in person. That answer your question there? All right, this is the second one. We already looked at it. I think we looked at this code already. Again, a couple of different ways of creating an array. This one uses the new operator in array again and puts 4 colors in there. This one uses a shortcut notation, but it's really doing exactly the same thing. Do I lecture in the lab? No, I do not lecture in the lab. It's a drop-in lab to work in your labs and to ask for help. Extra credit work during the labs. If you talk to me in the lab, and if you're having some issues and you're worried about your grade, then I can probably arrange something. And again, the output array is the very same as we had before. Because iterating through arrays is such a common thing and done with a for loop, there's a new special for loop created just for it called the for in array, for in loop. And it just kind of shortcuts, and it's just sort of a shortcut of using a for loop just for iterating through an array. So it's very common when you have arrays, you need to be able to iterate through them or loop through them one by one and see what's going on. This next one is going to do a sum of arrays. Let's take a look here. Okay, first we just do that. Let's look at the code. So it creates an array doing the shortcut notation, and it uses looks like 2 loops to just kind of loop through them. And this is just showing you the traditional for loop doing it, and this is the newer for loop that's just a specialized way of doing it. It says for var element is in the array, and this just takes the number, the element number, and instead of having to write all this out, it's just a shortcut way of doing it. There are some benefits to this as well. One is you don't have to remember that arrays are 0-based because it kind of takes that out of the equation. And there's also some benefits. I believe this type of for loop will skip undefined values, if I'm not mistaken. And we can look at that one, and you can see what it's doing. The 2 loops come up with the same result, 55. So again, we have the array here, we have the traditional for loop, and then we've got the, whoops, what happened? Not showing us the other for loop. Where's the other for loop? Okay. Oh, it looks like going to the for in loop statement to ensure that you manipulate only the existing elements. The for in statement skips any undefined. Okay. So it does skip undefined. So you get 55 each time. And then maybe an example of that, showing how that works. Any questions on that example? Now we get back to our roll die example. And then we have the icons this time. Now let's take a look at this one. Okay, so the frequency creates an array, and it's leaving this first one empty because it wants to reference it by, normal human numbers 1 through 6 instead of that. There's different ways of doing that, but in any event, we're doing it that way. Here, now it's creating an array for the die images, and I guess there's 12 different variations on the die. Yeah, because you can get 1 through 12. And the start, these event handlers, don't worry about them right now. They're not that important. we loop through the length of the array, which is the die images, and we're just loading them into the array. And they're probably offset by different numbers. And I think what happens is if we look at the HTML, we're going to see that probably all those images are there, and I don't know if they're invisible, or let's see what it's doing here in the code. So it loads all the IDs into an array. Let's see what's going to do. On the roll, it's going to the length of the die images again, and it's going through each one. Does it actually, when we click on it, actually put images up there? No, let's take a look. Oh, you can see what it's doing. Oh, that's interesting. So it's actually outputting the die as it does it. Okay, moving the images around. That's what this thing is doing. So it's setting the image, and sure, if we look down here, it's moving the image based on what it's rolling out, and it's moving them around. So if we were to look at here, we see we have die 1, die 2, die 3, die 4, and so forth, and it's simply moving them around as we roll. And then it adds 1 to each one of these. This frequency counter here, it adds 1 to it each time. And this looks like it's just outputting the table we see. So this table here being created and outputted. And then it's just keeping track of the frequency with which they all get counted, so you can see your different probabilities of getting each one. Any questions so far on this one? Let's see what we got here. Okay, so it shows you again the images, the output, and of course the source. Again, it creates our array for to keep track of the frequency. The image array, which is 12. The start loads all the image IDs into this array. Roll the dice, goes through and it uses the random number generator from 1 to 6, and adds the frequency in for each dice. Moves this set image is what moves it around, and then it adds it up to the total die. I'm not sure why we need to do the total die. And the tally just for the face value adds 1 to it. Set image, as we talked about that. The update frequency, which builds a table and outputs the table. Okay, that was interesting. I think we talked about random number generator already, but we saw the random image generator. We just did it with the array, which is kind of a cool thing to be able to do. So that when you click on it, it looks like you're actually rolling the die. Random image generator using arrays. It's a fairly commonly that arrays are used to store stuff and use a random number generator to just pick an element out of the array to make it seem like it's random. A lot of games work that way. So this is fairly typical of the way you might do something like that. Is there any questions so far?